네, 아침 일찍 개회식부터 힘차게 달려온 제9회 아시아미래포럼 1일차 마지막 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 이번은 특별 세션입니다. 불평등 해소와 지속가능성을 주제로 다양한 제안과 논의가 펼쳐질 예정입니다. 네, 아시다시피 지속가능성은 21세기 들어 국제사회가 가장 중시하는 의제입니다. 이번 특별 세션의 주제는 불평등 해소를 위한 새로운 상상력, 지속가능의제입니다. 네, 먼저 기조발제로 박청규 환경부 차관님이 예정되어 있으신데요. 일정 관계상 순서를 변경해서 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 너른 양해 부탁드립니다. 네, 첫 번째 순서로 미하엘, 라이터러, 주한 EU대표부 대사님께서 우리의 세계, 우리의 존엄성, 우리의 미래를 주제로 한 발제를 해 주시겠습니다. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage His Excellency Ambassador 미하엘 라이터러.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My pleasure to be here. I'm impressed by how many came, despite the nice weather, beautiful colors, good occasion to profit from nature. But I think we will talk a little bit about nature, how to preserve nature, how to preserve the planet, and how to address inequalities. One inequality is, as I said, some go for a walk, we have to work. I think what we have to address in this session, and you might already be tired after a long morning, how we can tackle inequalities through sustainable development in order to achieve the sustainable development goals in Europe. And therefore, I'm happy that I can represent the European Union in that field, because this is one of the occasions when I can talk about SDGs environment, where I'm proud to represent the European Union, because we have struggled for the last decade to be in the lead and to raise awareness and also to implement policies in the European Union, so that if we talk about best practices, that we actually have to show something and not only to talk about best practices. The EU is committed to sustainable development that meets our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable development has therefore been at the heart of the European policymaking in an integrated sense, because it does not make sense just to say, well, we have one policy which takes care of the climate, one of the environment, one of the oceans. We have to have an integrated and all European approach, and on international level, we have to implement the SDGs. The essence of sustainable development is a life in dignity for all, within the planet's limits that reconciles economic prosperity and efficiency, peaceful society, social inclusion, and environmental responsibility. This reflects the principle of leave no one behind, as Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, has formulated it. As a diplomat for 35 years, I have also learned that when we talk about security in the international system, about regional security, then environment has become more and more important, and also inequalities created by environmental problems or the problems of climate change. Therefore, we have to make sure that these imbalances and inequalities don't hinder us to have a sustainable policy. Therefore, we have to make sure that we create resilient societies within a resilient national and international system. So that's what we are trying on the European level, domestically, but also internationally. It is one of the principles of the European Union that our foreign policy should be based, or has to be based according to our treaty, on the same principles which we use at home. So there should not be a double speak, double standards for domestic politics and for international politics, and that also applies to everything related to climate change and the environment. The President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, stressed in his recent State of the Union speech that Europe has largely turned the page on an economic and financial crisis. Luckily, growth is back, now for nearly 21 quarters, roughly 5 years, and the unemployment is, for European standards, with 6.8%, relatively low. And we have, and that's the employment rate, 239 million people in employment. Because it doesn't make sense only to talk about unemployment, we have to see that we get as many people into employment. What we, of course, hope, and there I'm a little bit pessimistic, that the prospects which we have right now in international politics, the looming trade tensions or trade wars, will impact negatively on the international scene, and that will be to the detriment of the policies which we all try to achieve in order to make sure that we have convergence. Because we have learned that the past crisis has given rise to more inequalities, and this is a challenge for policy making anywhere in the world. So also inequalities between EU countries have decreased to some extent, there persists large discrepancies in growth, income, and employment prospects between the member states of the European Union. It is also clear that the top 20 and bottom 20% of the population on the income scale drifted further apart. There's an income inequality within the EU which has not yet returned to the pre-crisis level of 2008-2009. We also see a trend towards greater inequality of wealth, a growing concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals, but this is no European only effect. As demonstrated by the world-famous economist Thomas Piketty in his book Capital in the 21st Century, ultimately, global income and wealth inequality undermine not only the very foundation of our democracies, but also sustainable growth. Indeed, there are strong links between inequality, economic growth, and environmental sustainability. The EU has been a frontrunner in developing evidence-based policies addressing the interplay between the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. The European Union acknowledges that inequality is not only unfair, but also hampers the efficiency of markets and stifles growth. Economic growth and social progress go hand in hand. Our European social model is not just a high-minded principle, but it should be and should remain a living reality. I think we have to face that the trickle-down economics is over. There's a growing worldwide consensus that economic growth does not guarantee per se social well-being without the help of policy action that reduces inequalities and helps to foster growth. At the same time, we are more and more aware of the limits of growth. We cannot build a policy only on growth and growth and growth. But that's what the Club of Rome has told us already decades ago, and we are still struggling to adapt our business and economic models to something which we actually know for decades. The finding that economic growth in the past decades has been linked to growing inequalities and that future growth patterns carry the threat of further exacerbating disparities is clear from any books or studies, whether you take the IMF, the OECD, the UN, G20, or the European Parliament. There is a need for corrective action to achieve sustainability in economic and also trade terms, to make societies, as I mentioned, more resilient. The well-being of citizens is linked to productive and competitive economies which thrive through gains in productivity. In addition to smart and effective redistribution policies to address proactively inequalities and market failures, a proactive climate change and environmental policy action could also contribute to social well-being. Unsustainable production patterns, climate change and pollution are amongst the main drivers of inequality and poverty across the world. The recent 1.5 IPCC report is the most recent, but hopefully not the last, wake-up call which we have to address. The social environment and economic dimension can be mutually reinforcing if synergies and trade-offs are well understood and effectively managed at all levels of policy action, from the local, regional, national, international, and global level. Promoting one dimension at the expense of the other would ultimately lead to frictions. And I think there we still have to work. I made the experience that we have overcome one antagonism, that taking care of the environment or the climate is not in line with economics and economic growth. I think the greening of economies, the greening also of financial transaction and financial services, the discussion about green trade in the World Trade Organizations, these are all signs which tell us that we are getting on the right track. On the other hand, social inclusion and higher opportunities for all to participate in the labor market and society can provide an impetus to growth and innovation, including, as I mentioned, green innovation. We have to strive for a virtuous circle between economic productivity, environmental sustainability, and reduce inequalities in order to move forward. Also, societies and economies are more resilient to external shocks when the social fabric is strong and robust in place. The double meaning of resilience. Within this perspective, social welfare plays an important role in nurturing the economy of well-being. Together with tax, education, and wage-setting policies, they allow containing the rise of inequalities, a trend observed across the globe since the 1980s. They also have helped maintain the resilience of countries during the 2008 and 2009 crisis and is crucial in the effective implementation of the UN Agenda 2030. This agenda for sustainable development and the 17 SDGs adopted by more than 150 world leaders in September 2015 are an ambitious global response to current challenges, including growing inequalities, climate change, and poverty, and many more. On the social side, at least 7 of the SDGs may be considered as tackling directly social relevant aspects. SDG 1, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, and 11, you have them here. And there are also horizontal issues across most of the SDGs, such as disabilities or the gender issue. The European Pillar of Social Rights provides the main framework for the implementation of the EU of the social dimension of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. The pillar is a unique political achievement, adopting rights-based approach and representing a sort of real compass for upward social convergence in the European Union. Many of the pillar's 20 principles address inequality head-on. Just to give you some examples. First, equal opportunities and access to the labor market, because jobs are still our best equalizer. Second, fair wages, minimum income, and old age income, which are important means of reducing inequality. And thirdly, enabling social services, childcare, and support to children, which help to improve the equality of opportunities. With respect to policy action aimed at reducing inequalities, the EU is implementing the pillar and contributing to achieving the SDGs on a number of legislative and non-legislative fronts. Let me also give you some example. We are working on a fair European labor market. We advocate the principle of equal pay for equal work at the same place to realize that goal. The European Commission has also launched a proposal on predictable and transparent working conditions to inform workers of their rights and obligations from day one, from the outset. The Commission has also put forward a proposal to Member States on access to social protection for all workers and the self-employed. The objective is to support in irregular, non-standard forms of employment and self-employment who, due to their employment status, are not sufficiently covered by social security schemes and thus are exposed to higher economic uncertainty. That's an issue you are also dealing with here in Korea. And second, we are leveling, or trying at least to level the playing field by improving skills through what we call the New Skills Agenda for Europe. Education, training, lifelong learning are essential for a fair start in life and fair chances in life. We are also trying to address inequality of men and women. The Commission's work-life balance proposal will help men and women to better share responsibilities. And it would also make it easier for women to improve their position in the labor market, which is an absolute must in many of the aging societies. The European Accessibility Act proposal aims at reducing the social inclusion of people with disabilities by making products and services more accessible for them. I have worked with my colleagues, the ambassadors of the member states of the European Union here through the Paralympics to raise awareness. It was a very good occasion, and we concentrated on purpose on the Paralympics because the Olympics, the sports, that's business, and everybody was interested in. It was much more difficult in Paralympics, and I hope that this will continue. With respect to monitoring progress on the SDGs at the European level, because you have to check what you are doing, the European Statistical Agency, we call it Eurostat, released last month its second monitoring report on sustainable development in the European Union. With respect to SDG 10 on reducing inequalities, Eurostat's overall conclusion is that while economic disparities between EU countries have been reduced over time, income inequalities within member states have increased. So this is something which shows very clearly that if we are working together and if we have an internal market, that can help us to have a better economic performance. However, each and every member state has to work internally to come to a fairer income distribution. In addition to mainstreaming the SDGs aspect, such as inequalities into the EU policy framework, the EU is also reflecting on longer-term vision beyond 2020. The Commission is currently developing its 6th reflection paper towards a sustainable Europe by 2030 on the follow-up to the SDGs, including on the Paris Agreement and climate change. This reflection paper on a sustainable Europe will form part of the discussion of the future of Europe and present a vision for a sustainable European future as a comprehensive growth strategy for the member states. It is supposed to be adopted by the end of the year, and I understand you referred to that in the discussion this morning already. What is especially important, and that's one of the mantras of the European Union, we can only achieve on the international level these goals if we are working together in a multilateral manner. Therefore, we call upon all people, and not only states, to make sure that international cooperation is maintained and that we work together in a multilateral setting, whether we are talking about climate change and that we adhere to the Paris Agreement, which has been adopted by our leaders, and that we don't withdraw from multilateral settings, because this is not the manner in order to achieve, to master global challenges. Reducing inequalities is therefore at the heart of the agenda. And this agenda also gives us the need and the task to work with like-minded countries. And I do hope, Mr. Vice Minister, that we have a strong partner in the Republic of Korea. We have enjoyed a long-standing and substantive relationship, and we have to concentrate now on the SDGs. We have already talked about joining hands in the run-up to Katowice, which will be another landmark. We have, in the past few years, worked with Korea on climate-related domains, how to implement cooperation projects for the Paris Agreement, to support the Koreans' emission trading system. We have talked about business-to-business cooperation on green technologies. We are bringing European companies which are in that field, especially small and medium-sized companies, to Korea in order to foster cooperation. We have actions on sustainable cities. I just had breakfast a few days ago with Mayor Park of Seoul, who is very interested to work with us on that, and he is very proactive. We have research projects under Horizon 2020, which is the largest research project worldwide, and the new one, which will start in 2020, which is called Horizon Europe, has 1/3 of all the funds will be devoted to climate-related actions. So we are trying not only to talk, but also bring the money and the research attention to this. And again, there we are looking to a very close cooperation with the Republic of Korea. While we talk, politicians are in Bali, not to enjoy, hopefully, the sunshine, but to reflect further on how to keep the oceans clean. And I'm also happy to say that the European Commission has committed yesterday 300 million euros to be spent on ocean governance. So again, join us, because we need actions, and actions which help us to preserve the environment, to fight climate change, also help us to fight inequalities, because that can be an equalizer, and that's what we are looking for in a positive agenda. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, I'm extremely grateful for your rich insights and also EU's leadership in ocean governance as well. 네, 발제해 주신 라이터러 대사님께 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 이어서 먼저 예정되어 있던 기조발제 하도록 하겠습니다. 박청규 환경부 차관님께서 지속가능한 발전을 위한 불평등 해소라는 주제에 강연해 주시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 차관님을 무대로 모시겠습니다. 큰 박수로 강연을 청해 보겠습니다.
예, 안녕하십니까. 환경부 차관 박청규입니다. 원래 오늘 장관님께서 오셔야 되는데 잘 아시겠습니다만 지금 장관님 인사청문회 이후에 아직 그 청문 그 결과 보고서가 채택이 되지 않아 가지고 현재로서는 약간 좀 뭐 저희들 표현하면 공백기를 겪고 있다 보니까 제가 대신 오게 되었습니다. 먼저 오늘 그 한겨레 신문사가 주최한 제9회 아시아미래포럼에서 국제적으로 그리고 국내적으로 매우 심화되고 있는 이 불평등 문제에 대해서 이를 짚어보고 이를 환경적 관점에서 바라보고 그의 해결 방안도 사실 그동안에 우리 주한 EU 대사께서 말씀하신 것처럼 이 지속가능한 발전, 이 지속가능한 발전의 개념에서 이런 우리 사회의 특히 경제 문제와 포함한 경제, 사회 문제, 환경 문제를 동시에 해결할 수 있는 이런 지속가능한 발전에 대해서 말할 기회를 갖게 돼서 매우 영광스럽게 생각합니다. 앞서 우리 주한 EU 대사께서 우리 그 한국과 우리 주한 그 EU와 협력 관계에 대해서 언급이 있으셨습니다. 사실 SDG부터 시작해서 지난 특히 기후 변화, 앞서 EU 그 대사께서도 이야기했습니다만 특히 우리 배출권 거래제, 이 배출권 거래제 개념, 이 우리나라 온실가스 발생의 한 70% 정도가 사실 그 대상이 되고 있습니다. 지금 현재 한 600개 정도 기업이 대상이 되고 있는데 이런 배출권 거래제의 정책의 입안 과정, 그다음에 거기에 따른 각종 규칙을 제정하는 데 사실 EU와 굉장히 저희들이 긴밀히 많이 협력했다는 걸 이 자리에서 빌어서 그 협력해 준 것에 대해서 다시 한번 감사드리고 특히 기술 협력, 그다음에 Sustainable Cities 이런 파트 여러 가지 분야에서 우리 계속 협력하고 있다는 말씀드리겠습니다. 오늘 아마 많이 국가가 불평등에 대해서는 아마 많이 들으셨을 겁니다. 그래서 제가 이거는 빨리 그냥 스킵을 하겠습니다. 국가 간 불평등뿐만 아니라 국민에서 계층 간 불평등도 있고 이 자원 소비의 불평등, 당연히 자원 소득의 불평등도 있고 이것이 어떻게 보면 이제 환경적 불평등은 이 그림을 보시면 훨씬 더 명확하게 알 수 있을 것 같습니다. 이쪽 그 위에 상단에 보시면 이제 사막화 진행된 걸 나오는 거고, 그 다음에 그 우측에 있는 것은 이제 홍수를 나타내는 겁니다. 그 다음에 그 왼쪽 하단에 여러분 왼쪽 하단에 보시는 것은 그 해수면 상승에 따른 그런 그 모습을 저희들 얘기를 해놓은 거고 우측 편도 마찬가지 되겠습니다. 그 어떻게 보면 그 환경 관리 능력이 꼭 그 나라의 환경에 대한 관심으로만 해결될 수는 없습니다. 경제적 개발 정도가 굉장히 큰 영향도 차지하게 됩니다. 이 왼쪽 상단에 보시는 산은 우리의 동포의 북한에 있는 산을 지금 보여주고 있습니다. 거의 민둥산이 되고 있고요. 그다음에 우측은 우리 남한에 있는 산을 보여주고 있습니다. 왼쪽 하단에 있는 강은 특정 국가의 그 개도국 중에 그 강을 나타내고 있는 거고 우측은 우리나라 생태하천을 지금 보여주고 있습니다. 이런 불평등 해소 노력에서 그 국제사회의 노력을 이번 게 간단하게 제가 말씀드리는 게 좀 도움이 될 것 같아서 이 그림은 2000년도에 밀레니엄 서밋이라고 해가지고 MDG를 최초로 말씀드리는 게 좋겠습니다. 여담입니다만 사실 그 MDG를 만들었던 분은 그 얼마 전에 작곡하신 우리 코피 아난 전 유엔 사무총장님입니다. 저희들 그 유엔 사무총장님을 보면 우리 자랑스러운 우리 반기문 전 총장님도 계십니다만 그 유엔 공무원들 사이에서는 그런 얘기를 합니다. 사실 그 반기문 총장 약간 좀 불행하셨다. 왜 불운하셨다 그러죠. 불행이 아니라 불운하셨다 하는데 그 이유는 하나입니다. 그 전임인 코피 아난 총장이 너무 유능해가지고 후임 총장은 굉장히 힘들었다. 그런 유엔 공무원들의 그 농담이 있었습니다. 사실 보면 이 MDG 관련해서 8가지의 그 목표는 굉장히 의미가 컸던 겁니다. 특히 그 첫 번째 목표, 그 가난 퇴치하고 빈곤 퇴치는 어떻게 보면 굉장히 큰 목표였고 그것에 따라서 성과도 굉장히 많았다 이렇게 볼 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그 MDG의 성과 중에서 첫 번째 그 가난 퇴치에서 보면 1990년에는 1.25달러 이하로 생활하는 빈곤 인구의 비율이 약 37.1%에 해당됩니다. 그렇습니다만 그것이 목표년도 2015년도 가면 목표는 얼마였냐면 18.5%인데 실질적으로는 10% 이하로 떨어졌습니다. 9.6%였습니다. 그 이유는 우측편에 보시면 쇼웨인 글로벌 파버티 퍼센트로 나와 있는 거 있습니다. 특히 이스트 에이저 앤 퍼시픽 지역, 이 우리 말하는 이 중국, 아시아, 중국, 인도를 포함한 이쪽 지역에서의 급격한 그 소득 수준 상승이었습니다. 이에 따라서 빈곤 인구가 급격하게 감소됐는데 그 결과는 뭐겠습니까? 그 바로 밑에 있는 그림을 보시면 세 가지 밑에 칼럼에 세 가지 그림이 나와 있습니다. 왼쪽 편은 뭐냐면 그 CO2 농도가 그 하와이에는 마우나 로어라는 지역에는 CO2 농도가 급격하게 상승한 걸 보여주고 있고, 그다음에 가운데 중간에 있는 그 그래프는 생물 다양성이 감소하는 겁니다. 생물종이 멸종하는 걸 보여주고 있고, 우측편에 빨간색으로 되어 있는 그 지구 그림에 빨간색으로 되어 있는 것은 사막화가 훨씬 더 진행되고 있다는 걸 보여주고 있습니다. 물론 그 선진국의 이 그림에서 보시면 파란색은 선진국이고 빨간색이 개도국이 되겠습니다만, 이 개도국의 어떤 소득 수준 향상을 저희들에게 비난하면 안 됩니다. 당연히 개도국도 충분히 물질적 풍요를 누리고 발전해야 됩니다. 그렇다고 해서 그분들이 그 선진국들이 잘못된 길을 그대로 따라가는 게 놔두면 되겠습니까? 그건 우리 지구가 충분히 지탱하지 못할 것이다. 그렇게 좀 보고 있습니다. 이 그림은 뭐 그냥 간단하게 말씀드리자면 200만 년 전에 그 우리가 오스트랄로피테쿠스라고 하는 호모 속이 그 출현한 이후에 1000년 전에 우리가 잘 알고 있는 호모 사피엔스 그래서 농업혁명이 일어났고 1750년 경에 우측편에 보면 산업혁명이 일어난 것을 보여주고 있습니다. 이러면서 나타난 게 지금 현재 보면 그 어떤 현상이 지구에 나타나고 있는가? 왼쪽 위 상단에 보시면 그 CO2 이산화탄소의 농도가 되겠습니다. 지난 1000년간의 이산화탄소 농도가 되겠는데, 이 산업혁명 이후에 산업혁명 1750년을 본다 그러면 1750년에 약 280 ppm 정도를 차지하던 CO2 농도가 이산화탄소 농도가 현재를 보시면 그 2015년도에 우리 심리적 마지노선으로 여겼던 400 ppm을 넘었습니다. 그리고 그 뜻은 뭐냐면 이런 주기, 특히 지난 10월 초에 인천 송도에서 그 기후 변화에 관한 정부 간 위원회 IPCC 회의 그 총회가 열렸었고, 거기에서 1.5도씨 그 지구 기온이 1.5도씨 상승에 관한 그 보고서가 채택이 돼서 발표된 적이 있습니다. 굉장히 전 세계에 충격을 주고 있는 내용이 되겠고, 그 내용은 올해 그 12월 폴란드에서 그 개최되는 제24차 기후변화 당사국 총회에서 어떻게 보면 그 국가 간의 합의를 위한 뭐 노력을 더 가속하라, 그런 메시지로 전달되고 있습니다. 그다음에 그 상단 오른편에 있는 것은 뭐 잘 아시겠습니다만 이 스모그 현상을 자세하게 보여주고 있는 거고, 그다음에 왼쪽 하단에 있는 그림은 그 야경, 전 지구의 야경을 보여주고 있으며, 우측편에 있는 하단 그림은 우리가 흔히 말하는 쓰레기섬, 오대양에 있는 쓰레기섬을 보여주고 있습니다. 이 쓰레기섬 규모가 우리 한반도의 7배라는 것이 지금 이야기 나오고 있고, 잘 아시겠습니다만 우리나라도 지난 4월 초 이른바 그 쓰레기 대란이라고 해서 폐비닐, 그다음에 페트병 수거 거부하는 사태 그게 나왔고, 그에 따라 상당히 많은 힘이 많은 비난 저희 환경부가 많이 받게 되었습니다. 그 이후에 지금 현재 우리 그 커피 전문점 가서 보시면 커피 전문점 내에서는 우리가 일회용 컵을 쓰지 못하도록 돼 있고, 그걸 지키는 우리 시민들 숫자가 지난 8월 저희들 조사에 의하면 한 81.4%였습니다만 저희들 10월 초에 조사했을 때는 거의 90% 넘어가는 그런 시민들 그 어떤 협력과 성숙한 시민 의식을 저희들이 볼 수 있었습니다. 물론 뭐 이 그림은 아마 잘 아시겠습니다만 그 일루시란 말, 특히 덴마크 노벨 화학상 수상자인 폴 크리천이 말하는 겁니다. 그러니까 현대 지질 세대에 구분해 봤을 때 선 캄브리아대, 고생대, 중생대, 그다음에 현재는 신생대 제4교 홀로시에 해당됩니다만, 올해 이분은 이런 폴 크리천 이분은 현 시대가 바로 일루시다. 일루시라는 개념은 인류가 이런 지층을 지배하는 시기다. 어떻게 보면 인간이 어떻게 보면 그 생물종이 일부인 인간종이 다른 생물도 지배하면서 지구에 대해서 충분히 어떻게 보면 지구의 그 지속 가능성을 제한한 게 아닌가, 좀 그런 우려가 있습니다. 이분은 아마 잘 알고 계실 것은 1983년대 유엔 그 의뢰회에서 이분은 그 노르웨이 여성 최초 여성 수상했던 그 브룬트란트 여사입니다. 이분이 1983년도에 환경과 개발에 관한 세계위원회를 구성해서 87년도에 최초의 보고 Our Common Future라는 이 보고 아주 지금 이런 지속 가능 발전의 개념을 최초로 말씀하신 분이 되겠고 그걸 정립하는 개념이 되겠습니다. 이 개념이 아직도 30 넘어도 계속 유효한 게 너무나 명언이죠. 뭐 후세의 지속 발전 그 가능성을 해하지 않고 현 세대가 발전하는 방안 너무나 명언을 남겼습니다만 이런 개념을 적용하는 건 사실 쉽지는 않습니다. 그게 저희들의 현재의 과제다 이렇게 생각하고 있습니다. 그다음에 아까 그 MDG에 이어서 2016년부터 2030년까지 적용될 유엔의 새로운 포괄적 접근 그래서 SDG라고 하는 거 아까 우리 EU 대사께서 보여줬던 그 유명한 이 그림이 되겠습니다. 사실 그 이후로 그 뭐 유엔이라든가 UNDP, UNEP, 월드뱅크 모든 국제기구에서 이런 그 뭐냐 SDG를 달성하기 위해서 노력하고 있고 한국도 마찬가지입니다. 한국도 지금 현재로는 원래 그 참여정부 시절에는 대통령 직속으로 지속가능발전위원회가 구성돼 있다가 그 이명박 정부 들어와서 그 지속가능발전위원회가 환경부 소속으로 바뀌고 녹색성장위원회가 들어섰습니다. 제가 그 경과를 설명드린 이유는 그 지속가능 발전에 보통 저희들이 보통 3필라라고 합니다. 3필라가 그 경제발전, 사회발전, 그다음에 환경보호가 되겠는데 사실 그 우리나라 입장에서는 그 MB 정부 때 이야기했던 것 중에 하나가 경제 발전과 환경 보호가 두 개에 대해서 포커싱을 하자, 집중을 하자 그런 취지로 녹색 성장이라는 이야기도 하면서 추진했지만 사실 전 세계적으로 가장 그보다 더 큰 개념, 그게 바로 흔히 말하는 지속 가능 발전이 되겠습니다. 사실 지금 지속 가능 발전에 대해서 현재 그래서 현재 문재인 정부 들어서서 지속 가능 발전과 녹색 성장 개념을 어떻게 할 것이냐가 어떻게 보면 저희들의 큰 고민이 되고 있는데 현재까지의 저희들의 큰 방향은 녹색 성장 그 개념은 어떻게 보면 OECD라는 그런 조직 통해서 상당히 많이 그 진척이 돼 있습니다. 지속 가능 발전 개념은 UN 차원에서 많이 돼 있고 두 개념이 꼭 그 충돌한다 이렇게 볼 수 있겠지만 저희들은 기본적으로 두 그 녹색 성장을 포괄하는 지속 가능 발전 개념으로 그렇게 되는 게 가장 좋지 않겠느냐. 특히 그것을 저희들은 무슨 옛날 그 2002년도에 남아공에서 개최된 리우 플러스 10이죠. 그 회의에서 그 개최된 그 결과물인 JPOI 요하네스버그 플랜 오브 임플리멘테이션 거기에 나와있던 그 문장 중에 이 경제 발전, 사회 발전, 그 환경 보호는 각각 독립적으로 작용하지만 이 세 가지 필라는 서로가 지지해주는 그런 형태를 취할 때가 가장 이 지속 가능 발전이 쉽게 달성된다 하는 그 측면을 저희들은 굉장히 주목하고 있습니다. 따라서 우리 경제 발전도 그 과거의 그 성장 위주의 그런 발전보다는 우리 한계 내에서 흔히 말하는 대로 그 우리 잠재력 이내에서 그 단계적으로 발전하는 그런 걸 저희들은 가장 선호한다 이렇게 생각해 주시면 될 것 같습니다. 현재 그 정부에서는 한국형 지속 가능 발전 목표 이 KSDG라고 저희들 표현하고 있습니다. 그걸 지금 새롭게 좀 수립하고 있습니다. 이를 위해서 현재 23개 부처로 구성된 관계부처 협의체를 지금 구성해서 운영 중에 있고 그다음에 동시에 실무 TF도 구성하고 있고 그다음에 제일 중요한 게 사실 제 오른편에 나와 있는 이해관계자 그룹 KM고스라는 이 장애인분들, 여성분들, 청년분들, 청소년, 노동자, 농민, 이주민, 동물보호단체, 그다음에 산업계, 과학기술계 이런 모든 그룹들을 이해관계자를 포괄해서 다양한 목소리를 담아내려고 좀 노력하고 있습니다. 이런 금년까지 저희들의 목표는 금년 내에 이런 것을 갖다 평가할 수 있는 평가 지표를 저희들 조금 더 구체화할 예정으로 있습니다. 특히 저희들 제일 중요하다고 생각하는 것 중에 하나가 우리나라 특성에 맞는 목표를 만들겠다는 겁니다. 현재 그래서 이런 특히 지표 개발이 굉장히 쉽지는 않습니다. 이 지표 개발을 위해서 현재 환경부하고 통계청이 같이 협의하면서 어떻게 하면 우리나라 사회를 좀 더 장기적으로 지속가능하게 발전시킬 수 있을 것인가, 그걸 저희들이 고민하고 있다고 말씀드리고요. 이 중에서 목표 중에 중요하다 생각하는 게 현재 우리 사회가 겪고 있는 이 저출산, 고령화 이 문제가 되겠고, 또 하나가 이 소득 양극화 문제. 이건 어떻게 보면 사회적 지속 가능성에서 가장 중요한 두 가지 이슈라고 생각을 합니다. 다음으로 환경적 지속 가능성은 잘 아시겠습니다만 현재 그 미세먼지 이슈, 특히 올 지금 벌써 지금 가을이 시작됐습니다. 겨울철부터 내년 봄까지 계속 이어지는 이 고농도 이런 상황이 미세먼지가 발생했을 때 우리 국민들이 겪을 그런 고초, 그걸 해소하기 위한 수도권을 포함한 이 고농도시의 비상 대응 조치, 이 문제에 대해서도 저희들 계속 고민하고 있고, 관련해서 이런 국민들의 적극적인 협조와 그런 양해를 저희들 좀 구하고 있습니다. 다음으로 이 플라스틱 쓰레기 문제. 조금 더 구체적으로 설명드리자면 저희들은 2022년까지는 어떻게 하더라도 일회용 쓰레기를 거의 50% 줄이기 위해서 여러 가지 지금 정책을 추진 중에 있습니다. 앞서 설명드린 것처럼 커피 전문점뿐만 아니라 지금 현재 제과점 가셔서도 저희들 비닐백 제공을 좀 저희들이 자발적 협약을 통해서 금지하고 있습니다. 그 다음에 참고로 목표를 좀 말씀드리자면 파리 바게트 경우는 금년 말까지 제과점에서 사용하는 비닐 90%를 금년 말까지는 절감하겠다고 저희들과 약속했다는 것부터 시작해서 오늘 아까 EU 대사님이 이야기를 안 했습니다만 사실 EU 쪽에서는 유럽 연합에서는 지금 빨대 문제까지 같이 좀 고민을 하고 있습니다. 아울러서 지금 여러분들께서 커피 전문점에서 테이크아웃용으로 갖고 나온 이 플라스틱 컵이라든가 종이컵 같은 경우를 저희들 다시 재회수하기 위해서 전용 수거함도 설치하고 있고 하는 여러 가지 방안을 강구하고 있다는 걸 보고 드립니다. 아울러서 경제, 특히 우리 현재 젊은 세대들의 이런 취업난을 포함한 이 경제 저성장 문제가 현재 우리 한국 사회가 안고 있는 그런 것이 되겠습니다. 당연히 청년 실업도 문제가 되고 있습니다. 물론 이런 배경적으로 남북 간 문제라든가 그런 여러 가지 문제가 있을 수가 있습니다. 기본적으로 환경부를 비롯한 정부 입장에서는 이런 지속 가능성 어떻게 보면 우리 현 세대에서 겪고 있는 현 세대가 그냥 누리고 있는 의미의 행복을 우리 후손까지 더 누릴 수 있도록 현재 우리가 조금 더 아끼고 그다음에 우리가 조금 더 불편도 참아가고 그걸 통해서 환경도 보호하고 경제 성장도 계속 일으켜야 된다 하는 그런 중차대한 목표를 향해서 정부는 여러 가지 생각을 하고 있습니다. 정부 정책 중에서도 굉장히 불편함을 초래하는 그런 규제도 있을 수 있습니다만 국민 여러분 그다음에 여기 계신 전문가분들께서도 많은 이해와 협조를 부탁드리면서 제 기조 발언을 끝내도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 기조발제를 통해서 지속가능한 발전을 위한 불평등 해소에 대한 깊은 해안을 공유해 주신 차관님 대단히 감사합니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 감사합니다. 다음 순서로 신광영 중앙대학교 사회학과 교수님의 불평등을 완화하려면 무엇을 해야 하는가라는 주제의 발제를 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 신광영 교수님을 큰 박수로 무대로 모십니다.
Good afternoon. My name is Kwang Yong-shin from 중앙 University. It is my honor and pleasure to be invited to the 9th Asia Future Forum. Today I will talk about some issues to tackle inequality. And my presentation consists of two parts. The first part, I will discuss some causes of rising inequality. And second part, I would like to focus on how to reduce the level of inequality in South Korea. So, first of all, this is my general scheme, theoretical scheme to explain the rise of inequality in South Korea. And the first one is economic crisis and neoliberal reform. Is a quite common factor to explain the rising inequality in the 21st century in Korea. In addition, I think there are three additional factors contributing to the rise of inequality. So second one is a population change. So here, low birth rate and rapid age. It is also well known to the ordinary people. And third part is family formation issue, especially the rise of single household. So I will explain why the family formation is important in understanding the rise of inequality in South Korea. So finally, I would like to emphasize the impact of wealth in shaping the level of income inequality. So those are four major factors contributing to the rise of inequality in South Korea. So this is share of income by top 10%. As you noticed, it is a part of the Thomas Piketty's analysis. This is a Gini coefficient over the last 3 decades. So we can see the continuous increasing inequality. And this is the trend of income share by the richest 10%, 5%, and 1%. So you can see the sharp increase of income share by top 1%, the red one. So we can summarize the general tendency of rising income inequality in South Korea after the financial crisis. Here, it doesn't work. So Japan and Korea share the same trend, the rising Gini coefficient, and also decreasing income share by labor. So you can see the East Asian case, including here China and India, the decreasing income share by labor and increasing inequality in general. So it shows the changes in income share by labor. Korea shows the almost 13% of decrease in income share between 1970 to 2014. And this is the relative poverty rate by employment status. I would like to emphasize some figure, self-employers. Almost 21% of self-employers are suffering from relative poverty. So definitely non-regular employees shows a very high level of relative poverty rate, 36.4%. So Now I would like to show us more detailed analysis of causes of inequality, and then I would like to suggest some proposal to tackle the rising inequality. Thank you. Okay. And there, we noticed diverse causes of rising inequality, changing in the labor market, the rise of non-regular employment, and also some role of trade union in wage determination is limited, and also there has been an increasing rate of elderly population due to rapid aging, and also gender disparity, gender inequality in terms of wage and income is quite large, largest among the OECD members. And also family changes, as I mentioned earlier, the rise of single household and the impact of wealth. I will show some detailed statistics. So in fact, we might have some ideas about non-regular workers, but we don't have enough knowledge and information about precarious work done by self-employees. So the economic status of self-employers is quite low. So average income of self-employment is less than that of regular workers. So it means that a large proportion of self-employers in Korea experienced very low level of economic status. And age and gender is an important part to understand increasing inequality. This is the mean annual household income by age cohort. The upper two lines indicate the raw mean annual household income, and lower two lines indicate some equalized household income by family size. You can see the increasing household income until the late 50s in their age, and then sharp decrease. And after 60, you can see a very sharp decrease of household income. Mostly the elderly over 65 shows a very high level of poverty rate. Almost half of them are suffering from poverty. And also age is an important factor to understand the rising inequality. You can see the Gini coefficients of market income by age cohorts. So old age shows the higher Gini coefficients. It means that there is an increasing inequality within each age cohort. So you can see the extremely high level of Gini coefficients in the 70s. But in the 30s, you can see the relatively low level of Gini coefficient. I can read the file on this screen. Okay. Sorry about that. So age gradient is an important fact of rising inequality in South Korea. And also it shows the very sharp contrast between male and female in terms of poverty rate. So female household shows the relatively higher poverty rate than male household. And also you can see some variation over time according to the age of household head. And I will talk about family in transition in South Korea. So you can see the relative poverty rate by household types. So you can see the similar pattern of rising poverty rate. Especially look at the second line, yellow line, single mothers poverty rate. So top line shows the poverty rate of the elderly over 65. And household size. Usually we ignore that aspect. Household size is an important factor in explaining the rising inequality. That we can see right now, 1/4 of total household is single household in Korea. %54 of them is suffering from poverty. And you can see the household with more than 3 household members shows a very low level of poverty rate. So it means that a single household is rapidly rising in number, and also a single household shows the highest level of poverty. So it means that in Korea, without dealing with the issue of single household, income inequality will increase. So that's the important part of the story we should look at. And also here is a very fancy, it's a combination of income distribution and wealth distribution. So okay, you can see the bipolarized shape of picture. So right-hand side, you can see the very rich group in terms of both wealth and income. The left-hand side, the blue block, you can see the very deprived social group, very low level of wealth and very low level of income. So it's a bipolarized shape of distribution of wealth and income. So this is the part of the problem suffering, income poor, and wealth poor. So this is some kind of a combination, considering all factors shaping income distribution and analyzing those factors to the total income inequality. So I'd like to show relative contribution of factors to income inequality in 2011 and 2017. So there are three major factors affecting the rising income inequality. The first one is in the middle, you can see the impact of employment status. Employment status includes employer, self-employer, and also employees, regular, non-regular, and non-employees. And the second highest impact of factors to income inequality can be found in wealth. So almost 18% of income inequality can be explained by wealth. And employment status, almost 20%. And finally, family size explained 14%. So usually we are talking about some employment status in explaining the rising income inequality. But in fact, the wealth effect is tremendous. And also family size is also remarkable in shaping income distribution. So what is to be done? So I will provide three criteria, and it is desirable, and also is it feasible in Korea, and also is it sustainable? Three criteria to evaluate some policy alternative. And here, proposal one. So I strongly suggest the government and public organization should assess the distributional impact of national policies, welfare policies, industrial policies, whatever policies should be considered. First of all, the government should assess the impact of those policies on income distribution. So here, inequality averse policy principle should be introduced to reduce income inequality. The proposal two, I would like to suggest some democratic ownership. The broad-based ownership of production is necessary, especially when we talk about industrial 4.0 and artificial intelligence and many other automation in production. We should share some benefit of scientific progress and technical innovation. So I would like to suggest some democratic ownership based on citizen stock ownership. Proposal three is quite common nowadays, reducing non-regular workers. And proposal four, I'd like to suggest an introduction of progressive net wealth tax, because wealth is an important factor in shaping inequality. So we should reintroduce progressive net wealth tax. So surprisingly, some conservative politicians in Britain strongly suggest the introduction of net wealth tax. Not Jeremy Corbyn, John MacDonald, but David Willett, the British minister under David Cameron strongly argued Britain needs progressive net wealth tax. Proposal 4 or 5 and labor market reform, definitely many presenters, discussants also argue the necessity of labor market reform. And proposal 6 is an expansion of public assistance to the poor. So I will show some facts of life. In 2017, the average annual income of the lowest 10% of household was 5.23 million won. The mean of public transport to the lowest 10% of household was 3.59 million won. So it's a very low level of income, both annual income and transport income. So there has been a strong penalty on single, elderly, and female household. Finally, I propose a housing subsidy and provision of affordable housing. It is now it's common because of rapid formation of bubble economy based on apartments and housing recently. So poverty due to the lack of affordable housing is quite common in Korea. The poverty rate of monthly renters is twice higher than homeowner and the lease of a household on a deposit basis. So housing problem is associated with the problem of inequality. So I would like to wrap up my talk, and here I emphasize the last two parts. Business should also reconsider the sustainability of economic growth by recognizing the disruptive impact of the concentration of wealth and rising poverty. Many previous presenters also talk about that. Inequality is an issue beyond partisan politics with a prolonged impact on the 21st century. Thank you very much.
실질적인 정책 대안을 종합적으로 제안해 주신 신광영 교수님의 발제 대단히 잘 들었습니다. 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 네, 9회 아시아미래포럼 마지막 발제, 첫 번째 날의 마지막 발제 앞두고 있습니다. 마지막 발제는 이강국 일본 리쓰메이칸대학교 경제학 교수님을 무대로 모시고 청해 듣겠는데요. 불평등은 혁신과 생산성을 줘야 하는가, 한국을 위한 교육이라는 주제에 발제해 주시겠습니다. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Good afternoon. I feel like I have lots of pressure to finish my presentation as soon as possible because this is the last presentation of today. In my presentation, I'll talk about the relationship between inequality and innovation and productivity growth. So I will discuss some lessons from my empirical study. Okay, this is intro. Fundamental question is this: how inequality is bad to economic growth? In economics, we have a lot of studies already examining several channels such as physical and human capital investment. But I believe that inequality is also very bad to innovation. So long-run growth will be also hampered by this rising inequality. So in this presentation, I will report my own empirical examination, and I will discuss some implications to Korea, because now in Korea we have kind of conflicts between so-called income-led growth and innovation-led growth. Okay, first, inequality and economic growth in economics. We have long debates about that. Recent studies, most of them report very high inequality is not that good. actually bad to long-run sustainable economic growth. Why bad? Because if inequality is high, then we have more political conflicts, human capital and physical capital investment will be down, and also inequality is not good for inclusive institutions. So these are theoretical studies. Empirical studies also report there is generally negative relationship between initial inequality level and long-run growth. However, for short-run effects, using some panel studies, we have some conflicting results. Thus, we need more studies to be done. But in consensus, we can say that in terms of long-run growth, probably inequality is very bad to economic growth. Okay, let's turn to stylized facts of rising inequality and stagnant productivity growth first. As you see, now, as Professor Piketty also reported, after the 80s, all of the countries, including developed and some emerging market countries, we are suffering from rising inequality. And together with that, very interestingly, productivity growth is also slowing down, especially after the global financial crisis. There are several explanations. Supply-side explanation about productivity growth slowdown, usually they emphasize the role of technological advancement or innovation. They say innovation itself is slowing down after 1970s in general. However, if you have demand-side explanations, Keynesians emphasize that falling aggregate demand is very responsible for productivity growth slowdown because it leads to lower investment for new technology adoption and R&D, which is called endogenous technology adoption argument, emphasized by new Keynesians. So in this regard, we cannot really separate demand and supply, short run and long run, because they are interrelated through the so-called effect of hysteresis effect that is also emphasized, by former Fed Chairman Yellen 2 years ago. So my point here is Keynes and Schumpeter should go together, and then we should think about the essential role of the government for managing aggregate demand and also public investment that are very important for long-run growth. Okay, this is showing Gini coefficient for some developed countries and emerging market countries. It's of course going up, which means that we have rising inequality after the 70s, especially 80s. And now this is what we call total factor productivity growth in OECD countries. After late 80s, it's also going down in general. And if we extend the time period, this is for the United States, again, we can see the tendential fall of TFP growth. Late 90s and early 2000s, temporary jump was there, thanks to the new economy boom, but it was not so sustainable. And then this is for UK, it's even worse than that in the United States. Yeah. This is from Robert Gordon's book. He's presenting supply-side explanation. He argues that after 1970s, TFP growth rate is generally lower than that in the former period, because in the former period from 1920 to 1970, the benefit of so-called second industrial revolution was very large, thanks to electricity, internal combustion engine, and so on. But after 70s, 80s, we have got so-called IT revolution, but its benefit is still very limited, he argues. However, this is another viewpoint. It's from Keynesians, arguing that TFP growth itself is determined endogenously by the investment of firms for new technology and R&D. And this graph shows this endogenous part of TFP is moving in tandem with TFP level in reality. And of course, after the global financial crisis, it's really collapsed because of the big shock to aggregate demand. Now, this is my main research question: how inequality is bad or harmful to productivity growth or innovation? There are several theoretical possibilities, as I already said, in terms of stagnant investment for innovation and new technology, argued by new Keynesians. Inequality is high, then aggregate demand is low, So it's actually harmful to innovation. And second, we have very interesting argument, so-called lost Einsteins. This is presented by Professor Chetty at Harvard. Recently, he is developing very interesting empirical study about equality of opportunity using huge microdata set in the United States. What he argues is this. If you have serious and high inequality, smart kids from poor family usually tend to lose a chance to be an inventor. So this is called lost Einsteins. I will get back to this later. And another one is so-called Kaldor-Verdun effect, argued by post-Keynesians. They argue that if wage is falling and inequality is high, then aggregate demand is low, and then productivity growth will follow to aggregate demand. So growth rate is low, then productivity growth is also getting lower because of economic scale and learning by doing effect. Okay, next one is, as Professor Wilkinson also reported, if inequality is very high, people tend to compare themselves with others. And with this social comparison, and if they feel they are treated unfairly because of high inequality in the working place level, then workers' effort is going down. That's maybe one reason why employee stock ownership plan firms perform better in terms of productivity. And finally, we have this institutional explanation, very well known by Azemmour and others. If you have high inequality, it's blocking inclusive development of political and economic institutions, so we have lower productivity and innovation. Now, this is from Chetty's study. The paper is titled, "Who Becomes an Inventor in America?" This graph shows that, of course, kids from rich family tend to become inventors much more than those from poor family. But more interesting is this graph. This graph shows y-axis inventors for children, and x-axis shows those children's third grade math test score using New York City public school data. And of course, if students are smart and they have high score in math score, then they will become inventors more. But the problem is, high-scoring children are much more likely to become inventors if they are from high-income families, like top 20% family. So if you are poor, even though your kids are smart, they will lose a chance to be an innovator or to be Einsteins, they say. So high inequality is leading to lower innovation and lower invention in general. Okay, this is empirical evidence for Kaldor-Verdun effect. This graph shows productivity growth is actually positively related with so-called Kaldor effect. This is just the economic growth rate. And then this is a graph showing workers' efforts are higher in firms with a characteristic of more shared capitalism, such as workers' more participation in their management level and more plans for employee stock ownership. Okay, now let's turn to the result of my own cross-country empirical examination. What I said is just theoretical possibilities and mechanisms, right? So what we need is maybe empirical evidence. So I conducted an empirical test for inequality innovation nexus. For dependent variable, I used patents per million data from World Intellectual Property Organization, and another one is total factor productivity from panel table data. And of course, for inequality, I use Gini coefficient from standardized World Income Inequality Database by Professor Salt, and another Gini coefficient data from the World Bank. And I run cross-country regressions controlling for some other control variables following other studies. And the bottom line of my finding is, I found that inequality is clearly negative and bad to patents in cross-country regressions, and also bad to TFP growth. Okay, this is just scatter plot of inequality and patents. You can see Korea, Japan, very good, and poor countries, generally bad. Interestingly, it's a roughly negative relationship, meaning that if you have higher inequality, then the patents number would be lower. But the thing is, you should be careful because in this graph, usually richer countries, more developed countries, tend to have less inequality and higher number of patents, of course. So we need to control for the level of economic growth in regression. That's what I did in this regression table. Maybe some of you are not so familiar with this table, but the bottom line is the number with more stars is important. So I have many models, but in all models, I include inequality variable, SW Gini, which means standardized world income inequality database Gini, and also GDP level, log of GDP per capita. And together with that, one by one, I add more control variables, private credit, and tertiary schooling years, and R&D expenditure out of GDP. And GADP, this is a commonly used proxy for institutional quality, and also trade openness. Surprisingly, in all regressions, we can find that the Gini coefficient inequality is very significantly negative to number of patents. For patent variable, I use natural log of patents per million. And then this is partial residual plot based on model 6. So after controlling for other variables, we can clearly see there is a negative relationship between inequality and patents. And the result is very robust to other settings, such as OECD group. It's different country groups. The number of observation different, but still same result. And also when you use different alternative Gini coefficient from the World Bank, again, qualitatively same. And even though I use longer run results, using from 1980 to 2013, still we got the same result. So the result is very solid and robust. And another test, this time I used total factor productivity growth. This is actually one of the best measures to show the effect of technological innovation. And when I use cross-country regression, again, I found that inequality is very harmful and negative to TFP growth. The model itself is slightly different from patent regression, but even after controlling for other variables, the result is very significant and robust. And finally, I also checked short-run effects by way of using panel data and regressions. It's a little bit, complicated because it depends on models and methodology. When I use pooled OLS or random effects model, the result is all the same to former result. But when I use fixed effects model, SWIID Gini is not so significant, not very. Instead, when I use World Bank Gini data, again, I found very significant results, meaning that even in the short run, after controlling for unobserved country-specific effects, inequality is clearly harmful to productivity growth. Okay, now let me talk about the Korean experience. Korea is a paragon of so-called East Asian miracle with very equal wealth and income distribution and very rapid economic growth. But what happened after the 97 crisis is totally opposite road compared with former East Asian miracle. What we have is probably vicious circle of rising inequality and stagnant economic growth. Of course, it's quite related with structural change of our economy, such as restructuring in the labor market, corporate sector, and financial sector, and so on. Okay, this is Gini coefficient. It jumped, and after 2009-10, it is falling down thanks to expansion of social welfare system, mainly because of the increase of pension money for the elderly group. But very recently, after 2016, it's going up again. And this is showing wage share, which means the share of workers' wage out of GDP and growth components. Wage share also fell down significantly after 97. And interestingly, the share of consumption out of GDP also fell down currently compared with before the crisis. So this is actually one of the background why the government right now is promoting so-called income-led growth. Together with this change, again, total factor productivity growth also falling down after 2010 very significantly. Now, I already discussed the current Moon government policy called income-led growth in the morning session. I think the problem is, the most serious problem is fiscal policy. Although the government argued that it would adopt expansionary fiscal policy, in reality, what's happening is opposite. That's what I call de facto austerity. Because this year, last year too, they made huge mistake in estimation of tax revenue. So that the result is, finally, at the end of the year, the fiscal surplus is much higher than originally estimated. This year, people say that tax revenue will be much more than originally estimated, about 30 trillion won, which is about 1.7% of GDP. It's huge mistake. So that finally this kind of wrongdoing or mistake of government macroeconomic management probably led to domestic economy's stagnation. And that's why we got harsh debates and criticisms. So we need to change this part of policy, hopefully. So this is showing cyclically adjusted primary balance, which is the best measure to show if your fiscal policy is expansionary or not. If you look at the Korea's series after 2016, 17, 18, it's all surplus. It's even higher than the period like 2013, 14. So now our government is doing de facto austerity. And this is showing Gini coefficient compared with other OECD countries. We have two series of Korea, the old statistics and new one. Interestingly, in both series, Korea is rather equal country in terms of market income, Gini. But when you use disposable income Gini, especially for the new series, Korea is rather unequal compared with other OECD countries, which is exactly because the share of public social spending out of GDP is very low, just half of the OECD average, about 10% of GDP. Now, let me very briefly mention the current debate between income-led growth and innovation-led growth. Of course, conservatives are against the idea of income-led growth, just arguing for more deregulation, for investment, encouragement or something. And also our government now pushing for deregulation much more recently. I believe that some part of reform of regulation is maybe necessary, especially for more competition and more new entry. But I think just deregulation is not the answer to innovation. What's important to innovation then? As Paul Romer, this year Nobel Prize winner, argues, of course, R&D and very active public support for that absolutely matter. But in that sense, Korean government is doing very well because R&D expenditure out of GDP is now more than 4% of GDP. So it's actually number 2, just near to number 1, Israel. However, lots of people, point out that our government stance is not so adventurous and very short run. So probably some kind of qualitative reform of public R&D system is necessary together with more active industrial policy. When it comes to deregulation argument, what I think its problem is probably this argument is still based on wrong division of demand and supply, inclusion or equality and innovation, and also state and market, as I discussed. So my point is we should not forget that inequality could hamper and bad to innovation and productivity growth. So bottom line is equality and income-led growth are helpful and conducive to innovation. This is a very important lesson for Korea, I think. Okay, this is my concluding remarks. In this presentation, I argue that inequality is harmful to innovation and productivity growth through several channels, and I report some empirical finding based on cross-country empirical, study. And for Korea, I really think that it's important and essential to overcome the forced division between income-led and innovation-led growth. I strongly hope that Korean economy can fly very high using two wings, including equality and innovation together. Okay, this is all for my presentation. Thank you.
네, 오늘 패널리스트로 또 발제자로서 토론자로서 대단한 활약하고 계신 이강국 교수님 대단히 감사합니다.